I'm going to introduce you to one of the most delightful concepts of Indonesian, which is the labor-saving device of the acronym. Now, English is a very wordy language. UN English is an even wordier language. So the UN takes 7 pages to define what Indonesian does in just 3 letters. Korupsi, kolusi, nepotism, I think it's self-explanatory. Or is it? So I want to take you to a place called Ohowait, which is in the Kai Islands in Maluku. And it's a village of very big families and very small houses. This is a priest's house, and it's by far the biggest in the village. And I visited there in 2004, I think, and I went back a couple of years ago. And so I had lots of catching up to do with my adoptive family and this and that. So I'm sitting down with Pak Yopi and Mama Ona, and what about this kid, and what about that kid? And they're telling me, oh, God, no, it's great, because our daughter just passed the civil service exam to become a teacher, didn't even pay a bribe. And I was like, wow, good for you. And he said, yeah, it was touch and go for a bit, because I heard on the grapevine that they were going to post her to a school in Waur, which is even more remote than Ohowait. And, you know, that's no good, because if you're in Waur, you're never going to get a promotion, your bosses aren't going to know about you, and etc. He said, but luckily, I know the guy who's deputy head of the education department, so I went to town, and I said to him, this is no good. And he said, I'm really sorry, but the surat, the letter is already, the list's already done. And so, sorry, but nothing doing. But luckily, a family member of mine is an MP in Jakarta. So I called him, and he called the head of the education department, and the head of the education department called his deputy, who's sitting in front of me. And they delayed the announcement by a day, and now my daughter is working in the district capital in Tual. Hebat kan? And I was like, yeah, hebat. And then they're asking me about my life. And I was like, oh, Jakarta, it's just becoming more and more impossible. So much so that now, you know, even though I ride a motorbike, you can't get anywhere. So I spend my whole time going the wrong way, you know, up one-way streets. I mean, so much so that I actually keep money clipped to the back of my driver's license, so that when I get stopped for doing that, you know, it's very quick with the police and this and that. And, you know, I think, oh, I guess that makes me a corruptor. Huh? And we laughed. And then I said, you know, in my kampung, that story that you told about your daughter, some people think that that was KKN. Long silence. And then Mama Ona says, shall we go to church? And, you know, and I felt terrible, because I was like, oh my God, you know, I've just accused my delightful host of being corrupt and this and that. And then I thought, no, actually, that's not what's going on. The long silence was because they didn't even get it. Because what they were talking about wasn't KKN at all. It was just using your family networks to actually do good things for your family. And that is not only acceptable, it's desirable. And so that got me thinking about the nature of corruption in Indonesia. And I think that you need to understand the history. So the foundational myth of Indonesia is that it was a Dutch colony for 350 years until Proclamator, Pak Suharto and Hatta declared independence from the wicked Dutch. But actually that's nonsense. It wasn't a Dutch colony for 350 years. The Dutch came here not as colonists, they came here as traders, monopolist traders at that. And so the Dutch East India Company was the world's first joint stock company. The world's first stock exchange, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, was created specifically to trade shares in that company. And what the adventurers who came to the East Indies on behalf of the VOC did was deliver shareholder value. And there was shareholder value in 2 places. That was in Maluku, where there was a lot of spices, and in Java, where there were a lot of people. Now, they were, you know, to create a good monopoly, of course, you've got to get rid of everyone else who's trading in these waters. And that was the Chinese, the Indians, and the Arabs who'd been here for centuries, long before the Europeans, and the other Europeans who came roughly the same time as the Dutch, which were the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and the Brits. So creating monopolies means building a lot of forts. This is Benteng Nassau in the Banda Islands. It means financing wars between squabbling tribes to get them off your back, etc. And it's very expensive. So much so that the VOC actually toppled into bankruptcy after nearly 150 years. Nearly 200 years, actually. So right at the end of the 18th century, the VOC goes bankrupt. But by that time, good lesson in capitalism, they are too big to fail. And so they're bailed out by the Dutch crown. Now, the Dutch crown are also not willing colonists, and they're also pretty much looking at this as an opportunity for extraction. So they went on building up their extractive industries, mostly plantations, in Java and in Sumatra. And for the rest, they pretty much allowed the little local potentates to rule the country as long as they collected taxes and incomes and passed them back on to the Dutch. So what happened then after independence was that the Dutch decided, so Sukarno declared independence obviously in 1945, but the Dutch thought that they were going to waltz back in after the Japanese surrender in World War II, and so the Indonesians had to wage a pretty unpleasant war for some years, 4 years, and in that time, basically, the army had to finance itself, and it did that through a lot of trading of illegal substances, but also trading of legal substances illegally. So the Indonesian army was built on the idea that they could make their own money as long as they went on fighting. And we're living with the consequences of that now. We're living with another consequence of the Sukarno years, which was that the economy went into meltdown, we had hyperinflation, and what happened then? Sukarno started using the civil service basically as a social security system for his mates. Because in hyperinflation, your salary doesn't count for much. What does count is the rations you get, sugar, rice, material for your uniforms. And so people wanted to become civil servants, not because they wanted to serve the public in any way, but because they wanted those rations. And then for the salary, well, whatever you can get out of your job by squeezing the people, you can make. So we're still living with the consequences of that now as well. Now, in the Suharto years, things actually got much better. And I know a lot of you in this room think of the whole Zaman Orba really as synonymous with corruption. But for about the first 15 years of the Suharto years, it was actually quite effective, the way he used corruption. Because what he did, really going back to the pre-independence model, was he gave contracts to the generals, yes, in logging and mining and many other things. But there was a quid pro quo for that. First of all, the generals had to finance most of the military budget. As recently as 2005, only 1/3 of the legitimate military spending, the stuff we know about, the stuff like this, the programs for Abdi Masuk Desa, who remembers that? You're too young, right? But programs like this, but their legitimate spending, only 1/3 of that was ever covered by the national budget. And the rest, they made up from the contracts that they got as part of the Suharto. Some people say kleptocracy, I would argue otherwise. He also gave contracts to a lot of conglomerates, many of them owned by ethnic Chinese. And yes, they had monopoly powers, but again, they had to deliver infrastructural development, they had to deliver jobs, they had to deliver capital investment, and by and large, they did that. And then Suharto's kids grew up, and they got greedy, and the old man started giving contracts to the kids. And he didn't demand anything in return. So now what happens? Indonesians actually don't like that kind of corruption. That's going back to the Dutch model of plain old theft. And so we had basically a popular rebellion, and the army, who also didn't like the fact that their contracts were now going to the kids instead of to themselves, just stood back and let it happen. And so we had reformasi. Now, one of the first things that happened in reformasi was we've got to get rid of corruption, right? So we're going to take the army out of the equation because the army shouldn't be involved in business. Now, shortly after that, I was working with the Ministry of Health in Jakarta, and I got an email from the then head of the World Bank office saying, oh, we're doing some notes for the incoming government, and could you give us your #1 policy recommendation in your area of expertise? Now, I was working on HIV, and I wrote back and I said, triple the military budget. And he wrote back and said, no, you misunderstand me. I mean in HIV. And I said, triple the military budget. Why? Because so HIV is being driven by drug injection. Drug injection is being driven by a tsunami of heroin. And the tsunami of heroin is being driven by the fact that the army has been cut out of legitimate businesses, but we haven't increased their budget to take care of even their legitimate spending. So they're now, in a very predatory fashion, making money out of illegitimate businesses. So take-home lesson from that is if you're going to make a big deal about wiping out corruption, understand the place that that corruption is playing in society, and it's not always just personal enrichment. Now, in the other important thing about the Reformasi era, of course, is decentralization. And that's been something that's very interesting indeed in Indonesia. What we've got now is 500 separate governments that basically are running almost everything from education, health, whatever. I think a lot of people in Jakarta, in the ministries in Jakarta, don't realize how little influence they actually have on what's going on in the provinces and in the districts. So in a way, again, we've gone back to the Dutch model of ruling through local potentates. But there's a difference. This time, the local potentates are directly elected by the people, and the other big difference is it comes with money. So 340 trillion rupiah this year went straight to the district level to be disposed of basically any way that the Bupati wants. And the Bupati wants a nice office. So this is in Banggai Kepulauan, this is in Maluku Tenggara Barat, my personal favorite in Wedah, 48,000 people. And the one person, there's also offices like this for each of the dinas, but this is the Bupati's office. Now, the Bupati of Wedah, this is where Wedah is in Halteng, Halmahera Tengah. The Bupati of Wedah, of course, because he's elected, has to give back something. And what he's given back is all of these wonderful things, including opening up the protected forest of Gebe for mining. He's given the population a $10,000 wall around the state guest house. And probably most popular of all, he's given every single person in Halteng, as far as I can see, a T-shirt with his photo on it. So, but of course what this means is that Bupatis and Walikotas in this country have a huge amount of money to dispose of, and that means it's a very desirable post, and so people fight very hard to get the post. And they wage quite expensive election campaigns. This is from Aceh, from Langsa in Aceh. And we're trying to take money out of politics. Of course, it's not working very well. So there's a real fear that corruption is increasing in Indonesia because of this sort of thing, because the locally elected heads of government have to get their money back. Now, I want to go back to Pak Yopi, who I was so rude to, because I think that certainly in the Suharto era, there was no way on earth that he would have been able to pick up the phone and change where his daughter was posted to, because decision-making was just too far away. So decision-making taken closer to the people increases the chances for corruption and patronage for KKN. Definitely true. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, I would argue. Why? Because the sort of corruption that we're seeing now is basically distributive corruption, and it's based on essentially something that is the very fabric of Indonesian society, and that is the keluarga besar. And the keluarga besar, the big family or the clan, sometimes is actually really a keluarga besar. I actually sat down with Pak Yopi, and he listed his family tree. These are the descendants just from his mother and father. The equivalent in my family is 2. And when I told him that, he looked at me as if I was, raised by wolves or something. But 93 descendants just from his, direct descendants, not counting spouses and whatever, just from his family. But the concept of keluarga besar is one that actually goes through the whole of Indonesian society. So you hear keluarga besar TNI, keluarga, the military big family, or the big family of Islamic students, or what and what. And the main characteristic of a big family is that actually resources get trickled upwards to the big person at the top one way or another, but that big person at the top then has a responsibility to take care of everyone in that keluarga besar. Now, if you work for the World Bank or one of those AusAid or USAID funded, programs, good governance, etc., that's corruption. And we're trying to wipe that out. But for a lot of Indonesians, that's the fabric of society. And I would argue that for a lot of Indonesians, the opposite of that type of corruption is not good governance, it's this, lolo gue gue. which, as those of you from Jakarta know, means literally you, me, me, but it basically translates into what's yours is yours, what's mine is mine, kind of dog eat dog. And all over Indonesia, those Indonesians who see Jakarta only through their daily worship at the altar of the sinetron or the soap opera, just look at that with absolute horror. We don't want to become lolo gue gue. We don't want to give up our patronage networks, our keluarga besar, because it's a really important part of the fabric of our society. And so I would argue that actually, yes, we can try and wipe out corruption, but let's try and make a difference between extractive corruption, which does nothing for anyone except people who have apartments in Singapore. Indonesians do not support that kind of corruption. They will, if you take money from the local hospital budget and then go and buy hookers in Mangga Besar in Jakarta or in Singapore, you know, they will vote you out of office if you're in a voted office. But if you're doing that more distributive patronage style, you won't get punished in nearly the same way. So this, I like this, tetap optimis. You know, we're going to wipe out corruption, and we're a little bit optimistic about it in the bottom. You know, we can be optimistic about that, but I would urge all of us to think really carefully about, and in a more nuanced way, about the role that corruption plays in society, because I think that actually the patronage keluarga besar type of corruption is something that is essentially called social capital by sociologists, and that's something that most people who give TED Talks are very keen to promote. Thank you.